Hey, Pickle, let's go to the hotline. And let's bring in the College Football Insider for Dave Campbell's Texas Football. We're joined by Shehan Jeyarajah. Shehan, do you read me?
I do. I don't know. We literally just did this last week on Friday. I don't know. Nothing's different. So I don't know what
Correct.
happened.
Well, nothing is different, and yet everything is different. Let's talk a little bit about the announcement that came down last night. We had teased it on Friday that we thought that a decision from the Big 12 was coming down on Monday, at some point on Monday. Board of directors got together and they decided that the Big 12 is going to go with a 9+1 schedule, basically the 9-game conference schedule plus one non-conference game. When this decision came out, did this surprise you at all?
No, it's mostly what we've been hearing. Look, there are a lot of contracts obviously still on. I mean, I think that the Big 12 was waiting in a lot of ways to see what the other conferences would do. And look, I think that you look at a lot of the other conferences. The SEC, for example, is moving to a 10-game schedule. Some of the other conferences are looking at a 10-game schedule. And the Big 12 quite literally does not have 10 games to play since there are only 10 members. There can only be 9 round-robin games. So I'm not too surprised that they decided to leave room for potentially one non-conference game. But again, finally, after all this time, we kind of have some clarity.
But there's still a lot of things up in the air. We don't really know what the schedule is going to look like. We don't know the start date. And furthermore, the question that I'm really interested in is which of these non-conference games are they going to play? Now, there's some of the schools we know, but just by process of elimination. I believe that TCU was already down to 10 games. And that their lone non-conference game left was their matchup with SMU. That seems like it's now obvious. But is there
So actually,
Go ahead.
I'll jump in and say the word is that. So actually, let me back up a little. So the Big 12 mandated that every non-conference game had to take place at a home Big 12 stadium. Now, the reason that I believe that they did this is so that whenever these teams are trying to get out of contracts, if they have a road game, they have a very easy out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so. But what's ended up happening is that because the TCU SMU game was scheduled in Dallas this year, that's where it was supposed to be this year, they've actually decided to cancel the game. So at this point, we don't necessarily know what TCU is going to do because they did, like you mentioned, they had Cal and they had, I want to say it was Prairie View A&M as their other game, both games that have been canceled at this point. So TCU is actually in the process right now of looking for what might be next.
So then looking forward then is who in particular do you think is are you anticipating these decisions coming down from? As in, what do you think Tech's going to do? What do you think Baylor's going to do? Texas, I know their game with LSU had already been canceled. Do you have a feeling yet on when the dust settles for the Big 12, which non-conference games in the state of Texas we are going to get?
Yeah, I think it's going to be decisions I think are going to come pretty quickly because, as you know, athletic directors don't like to be left up in the air. I think that Baylor's an interesting situation, for example, because they have a home game scheduled against Louisiana Tech and an FCS game scheduled against Incarnate Word. And I'm curious to see because you only get this one game, right? And it looks like, for example, Oklahoma's canceled their game with Army. Like, it looks like they're going to play Missouri State. They're going to stick with an FCS opponent, whereas obviously, with Texas, they've got South Florida and UTEP on the schedule. They're not going to necessarily have an FCS opponent. I'm curious to see what a school like Baylor does because I think it kind of sets the tone for what everybody else in the conference is going to do in terms of do they go for sort of a gimme payout game or do they go for, not that Louisiana Tech is a team that should beat Baylor, but a much more competitive game. So I think there's still a lot of decisions to be made, and I think it's going to really have a big ripple effect on how the Big 12 is perceived later this season.
We're talking with Shehan Jeyarajah, our college football insider here at Texas Football Today. Give all the conversation, #TF Today. Okay, so now the Big 12 has made their move. All the Power 5 conferences have now contracted their schedule. Everyone's going to play, at most 10 games now, for now. I guess my question is, where does that leave the group of 5 conferences? They've been relatively quiet so far, I think, waiting for these shoes to drop. Do you have a feeling yet on what those conferences now are going to do?
Well, I think that the biggest thing with all of this is that all of the Group of Five conferences were waiting to see, I think, whether they could get that payout for a Big 12 game, right? To go and play at their stadium. And the answer is only if you have a Big 12 or ACC team on the schedule, of course. So I do think that now that we have that clarity, decisions will be coming down a little bit quicker. Now, we've seen from the Sun Belt, I think actually today they released that they are planning an 8-game conference schedule with up to 4 non-conference games. Conference USA, we've kind of heard that same sort of thing, that things could be pretty normal. But I think that the thing that's going to be interesting is that I do think that conference play is going to be pretty standard across the Group of Five conferences. I think that it's going to be pretty normal. But I do think that there's going to be disparities among these teams in terms of how many games each team plays. Because again, like a school like UTEP, for example, right? Like UTEP had 2 games scheduled against Power 5 teams. The game against Texas Tech isn't going to happen in El Paso, we know for sure, but the game against Texas could still happen. So, we could be looking at 1 or 2 or 3 non-conference games, whereas like Texas State at this point is actually one of 2 teams in the country that has not officially had a game canceled at this point. So I do think that there's just going to be some disparities among scheduling, and some of these games might get canceled. Some teams might reschedule and try to get some money out of these games. But look, I think that at the Group of Five level, I think everybody was waiting for the Power Five to act. Now that that's happened, I think that there's going to be a little bit of a free for all.
You mentioned Texas State. They are in an interesting position, and they made some headlines earlier this week with the decision that came down that they are going to move their game with Texas or with SMU to a week forward. It was scheduled to be on September 25th, or September 5th, rather. Now it's going to be in week 0 on August 29th at Bobcat Stadium. Can you give us a little insight into why they made that decision?
Sure. So I think that this is true of also the Big 12, and I think it's true of really everybody around college football, right? So the NCAA allowed teams to move to a week 0, which is something that usually you kind of have to have special permission to do. And the reason that they're doing that is basically to try to stretch out the schedule as long as possible. So, for example, in the Big 12, they're going to have 17 Saturdays, up to 17 Saturdays to get done with these 10 regular season games and a title game. And the reason that you need that time is obviously because if you have a mini outbreak on a team, right, you need to quarantine players for 7 to 14 days. You might have to cancel games. You might have to reschedule. And having some of these extra weeks in between and having a lot of bye weeks gives you a lot more flexibility to be able to go in and have these measures in place and be able to cancel or reschedule or postpone games. And look, I think that the reality is that we've seen, for example, in baseball already, when you have positive tests, you have to cancel games. And when you're playing a 10-game schedule, that becomes a big issue. So adding some of these extra weeks into the picture really gives you a lot more flexibility to adjust on the fly.
The Big 12 made headlines yesterday. Today seems like, from what we're hearing, is a big day for a lot of other sports and for the FCS. It sounds like the Board of Governors of the NCAA is going to get together. Based on what does all of this, and I'm gesturing broadly, what does all of this mean right now for the status of FCS football in 2020? We know that a number of Division II conferences, basically the entirety of Division III, have already moved to the spring. Do we have a feeling yet on what this is going to mean for the FCS?
Yeah, the FCS is in an interesting spot because probably about somewhere between a third and half of their conferences have made at least some movement on football, right? But one conference that hasn't really at this point is the Southland Conference. And I think that you look at schedules that people have, I think that a lot of them know that if they cancel these games, if they push to the spring, they're losing potential payouts from Group of Five and Power 5 schools, or at least Big 12 schools. And I think that they're hesitant to do that for obvious reasons. Now, I do think that if the Group of Five were to limit their scheduling, or if the Power 5 schools were to potentially cut off all those Southland and FCS games, I do think that changes the calculus a little bit. But look, I think that the NCAA is going to be much more forward with looking at moving D2 and D3 to the spring than they are FCS, just because, again, you talk about, I talked earlier about that Baylor Incarnate Word game. If Baylor does select Incarnate Word to be the team that they play, they're making over $1 million to show up at that game. And I don't think that that the Southland Conference, for example, would want to risk that payout if they think it could still be possible. So I do think that they're going to kick the can down the road a little bit further on FCS. But again, everything that's kind of happened to this point has been somewhat of a surprise, so nothing would really surprise me at this point.
I guess that kind of leads me to my final question, which is, what are you looking for next? Well, I think we've talked about how, okay, all eyes were, after the SEC made their move last week, all eyes were on the Big 12. That was the very clear next thing to keep an eye on. What are you monitoring next as far as maybe the next shoe to drop?
Well, I think that it's a relative no-brainer for the NCAA to move D2 and D3 championships to the spring. And if that were to happen, I do think that we probably see the Lone Star Conference make a decision at that point. I think that a lot of the D3 conferences have already made that decision. So I do think that is a decision that they could make pretty quickly in the next couple of days. But otherwise, now that the Power Five is in place, I am really curious to see what the adjustments are for the Group of Five. I'm curious to see whether, we've heard these early returns from the Sun Belt to Conference USA. We haven't heard a ton about the American at this point. I think that the American is sort of the next big conference that probably will need to make some decisions. And again, for Texas State, I think is a good example. Like, do you expect to play 12 games this year if you're Texas State? When the rest of your conference is playing potentially 8 or 9. These are sort of the decisions that I'm going to be curious to see, is whether these non-conference games get canceled. And again, if these non-conference games start getting canceled even gradually, I think that's going to potentially have a big impact on what the FCS does. And I think you could see those decisions potentially coming down. Because eventually, I mean, we talk about college football as being, from a monetary perspective, a trickle-down sport, right? Like the Power Five pays out to the Group of Five and pays out to the FCS, who then pays out to Division II. And potentially, if these non-conference games are gone from the Power Five level and potentially somewhat from the Group of Five level, I think that it's going to have a real impact on those small college programs.
He's Shehan Jeyarajah. He is our college football insider here at Dave Campbell's Texas Football. Follow him on Twitter at Shehan Jeyarajah, and of course, see his fine work at TexasFootball.com.